We know how much you love talking about player feedback, and we do too. What's up, everybody? This is Let's Talk Customer Feedback, and I'm your host, Natalie. Thanks for listening, and thanks for telling your player insights pro friends about us. This is season 3, so let's get right into it. The gaming industry expects another booming year in both excitement and sales. But with the launch of many new games comes the realization that the market becomes even more crowded and the bar is raised yet again in all aspects, including games complexity levels, design, story, and character features. So, can leveraging player feedback help with this? Let's find out with today's special guest. The mix between quantitative and qualitative player feedback. Hello and welcome to Afogata's podcast, Let's Talk Customer Feedback. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Ayush Gupta, Analyst Team Lead at Sciplay Games. First, let's say hi to Ayush. How are you doing today?
Hi, Natalie. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm doing really good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you, and we're very excited to have you here. So, before we dive into more player insights, we would love to hear more about you. So tell us, who are you? What 3 words would you describe yourself?
I'm Ayush. I'm from India and have been an analyst for over 10 years now, and out of which 6 years have been in gaming. And I started my career in a consultancy working for different clients and different industries. And one of those clients happened to be Call of Duty, and that's how I was compelled to make a career in gaming. And since then, I've worked in Ubisoft and a few more companies working for different free-to-play games and games on PC and mobile and console as well. If there are 3 words that would define me, I think the first one is passionate. The second one would be spiritual, and the third would be that I'm a bit crazy in the sense that if I'm all on something, either I don't do it at all. So if I'm doing something, I like to do it with my 100% of my ability and my motivation on it.
That's awesome to hear. And yeah, I was going to say something before that. You have an amazing experience in the gaming industry, and that's why we're so excited to have you here. So thanks for sharing that. And since you've been in the
Yeah,
industry
thank you,
for so
Natalie.
long, what is your favorite video game of all time?
I mean, it's a tough question. I guess anyone who answers this question cannot have one answer to it. So in my mind, there are like 3 games like I cannot differentiate between, and because they have a huge impact on me and even in my career. The first game is FIFA because that's the only game I played like competitively. I used to go into competitions when I was in college, and I've won a few in my college days as well. The second was is GTA Vice City because that's the first foray into open world games where you could interact with the entire environment, and they became like a landmark in terms of open world games. And the last game that I really like is Sims because it's the future of simulation of real life events. And I was really excited to play it when I played it for the first time, and I was really inspired by it.
I agree. I was obsessed with Sims and building your house and your friends. I was obsessed with it. So I completely relate to your answer. And the last question that I would love to ask you to get to know you a bit more is, if you have a time machine, would you travel to the past or the future, and to when?
Okay, this is a question that I've always thought about a lot in my life. It's not just for this podcast. So, in terms of going into the future, it seems really exciting knowing what will happen in the future in the next 40 years, 50 years. But I feel that if I go to the future, I'll be like a caveman, not able to understand the technology of that time. So it's better to, go to an ancient civilization and learn about how they lived, like maybe 2000, 2500 years back, and understand more about the history because history is always, disoriented. It's not never linear. So I would really love and understand the world of that time.
I love that answer, and I think that that would be so interesting. You would definitely look like a crazy person, but yes. And now, before we dive deep into today's subject, let's listen to a short story from the tales of our feedback crypt.
When the long-awaited Duke Nukem Forever finally released in June 2011, it was met with an avalanche of negative reviews and widespread disappointment. Certainly not a good sign for the game or the Duke Nukem series. The situation was made one extra bit worse by the interference of marketing representative Jim Ratner. In an infamous Twitter outburst, Ratner stated his intention to limit review copies of future games he represented by blacklisting any vocal critics of Duke Nukem Forever. Even after 2K Games formally cut ties with Ratner's firm, the troubling implications of his statement still lingered. Thank you for joining me, and see you next week on Tales from the Feedback Crypt.
And with that story in mind, we can't wait to hear what Ayush has to say about all of this today. So let's start. So again, as we discussed before, Ayush, we saw that you have a lot of experience in the games industry, working at places like Ubisoft, RedHill Games, and now Sciplay. Can you tell us about your experience at these companies, and can you introduce us a bit about your role now?
Yeah, definitely. So, like I mentioned, across my experiences with working on Call of Duty, that's my first game that I ever worked on. And at that time, I was just learning about the gaming industry and how things actually work for any game. Moving on to Ubisoft, I was part of a lot of mobile games, live operations of a few mobile games, and at the same time, I was able to create a small analytics team for the QA team as well. They have a huge testing studio in Pune where they test these games, test out the issues that these games may have. And I was also part of building that the analyst QA team, so that they can help these testers understand what parts of the game they have tested, what maps they have tested, and so on. And this is something which is very unique that I did for Ubisoft. And moving on to RedHill Games, I was part of building a new game from scratch, which is again a brand new experience for me because I've never done that before. And my role incorporated building data pipelines and data architecture from scratch, also making sure what are the data points that we need to track for different players. And it's the kind of the same in Sciplay. We are, building a new game, and I'm part of the data pipeline, data architecture processes, and soon when we go into different kind of launches, we'll do a lot of live operations and A/B tests, which I'll use this data to help the designers, the producers, and the product team to understand the different KPIs of the game and how we can improve the game, give them brand new insights about it.
That sounds extremely interesting. And you mentioned that you work with a lot of data. And how does player feedback influence your day-to-day job?
I mean, it influences the entire core of my job. According to me, even as an analyst, the player data that we get, the gameplay data, that is the player feedback. I mean, in my opinion, and we use it on a daily basis for our reports, for our insights. We have to use it all the time. And as for player feedback in general, I feel it is important for a game when you have a certain player set maintained. So if your retention and DU is at a certain level, that's the time where player feedback is the most important. You have a certain number of players in the game. Now you can understand what feedback they can give you. You can take the game from, let's say, it is at a level 3, you can take it to level 10 or level and beyond. But to take a brand new game from level 0 to level 3, that's where the player feedback would have the minimum impact. You can do a lot of player research, what players like, uh, what kind of games players want, and even from a design perspective, you understand what kind of game you are building and for what audience. But still, it's a creative process from the design team, from the art team, from the UI teams, and they build a game and they need to put it out there, and it needs to go to a certain level before the player feedback can come into the picture and take it to the next level.
Right. And what is the type of data you search for when doing player research? What are the metrics you look to optimize the game's performance, for example?
Then for player research, I feel it totally depends on the kind of problem I'm trying to solve, and like what's the question and what's the problem that we are facing right now. If the problem is that, okay, we have a game in mind and we need to find the right audience for it, then we try to find, okay, if we are making, let's say, an RPG game, what kind of audience we can target and in which countries we can target that. This is the kind of player research we would like to do. And let's say if we are looking for a different mechanic in itself that we are trying to build, in that scenario, there's a different kind of player research we'll do. We'll look at what's working in the market, what has worked previously, and what has made the most money in the last few years. What is the highest types of games that have come up in the last few years. So those are the kind of things we look at. And that's where we need to understand the question and then start doing a player research. Excuse me. In terms of the different metrics that we look at, again, it depends on the type of the game and the phase the game is in right now. So let's say a new game that is launched into the market and it's in its tech launch phase. At that time, we want to make sure that the players have a good experience technically. There are no FPS drops that happen. Players are able to load the entire game without issues. The loading time of the games is as minimum as possible. So all these things come into the picture at that time. Now let's say we have already done that and we are in a soft launch phase of the game. Here you look at the REM metrics, basically the retention, engagement, and monetization metrics, like what is happening, how many players are we retaining in D1 compared to D7 and D30, things like that. So and like a game for Call of Duty, which is launched every year, you don't need to actually focus on the FPS drops and all those metrics. You directly go into engagement. If you increase engagement, revenue and retention will definitely follow.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And out of everything that you are mentioning now and all of this data that you utilize, in your opinion, what are the top 3 player insights that bring your team the biggest impact?
So if we are talking about, free to play games, I think the most important metric, what most important kind of insight that we would like to know is what actually converts a player into a payer.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as a player is converted, I guess they are more engaged into the game, more likely to be in the game for a longer period of time, and which in turn increases the LTV of the entire game. So that's a very good insight to have if we really want that. Another insight that I can think of is how do we increase the engagement and stickiness of the game? How we make sure that players want to play our game more, so that it's we understand that that at least for an hour, if you're playing the game every day, what makes you stick to that? What are the different aspects of the game that makes you stick to the game? So these are kind of insights that we would like to know. And the third insight that is, some of the most important things that we like to know is during the first time user experience, what makes the player leave the game? We can understand the trigger points. Okay, this is the player where players are dropping, but according to me, even before the trigger point comes in, the player has certain perception about the game, and the trigger point may lead him to quit from the game, but there are other things as well which has made the player quit. And these points, it's very hard to understand from the data.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's going to come later in my questions as well. But because you're in the analyst team, you'll usually get all of this quantitative data, and then you're missing kind of like the qualitative data to complete the big picture. So I'm gonna get there in a bit.
Yeah.
But my next question is, what determines how quickly you get an insight? What usually is the most time-consuming element of the work of getting an actual insight?
So as soon as you start asking the right questions, you get to the insight. And as an analyst, you come up with a lot of hypotheses. Okay, if this is happening, maybe because of X or Y or Z reasons. And you go through all of these three, and you might end up disapproving all of them. And then you need to ask another question. And this is the kind of process that you go through. And let's say you have an hypothesis, you are able to prove it. Now there'll be a few more hypotheses that will come in response to that hypothesis. So this is the kind of funnel you need to follow. And as soon as you start asking the right question, you're able to prove it or disapprove it. That's how you get your insight. And this whole entire process can be cumbersome sometimes, and it can also lead you to nowhere, initially, but eventually it will make sure that you find the right path.
Yeah, I agree. Being an analyst is, I sometimes it's hard to understand, but really the asking the question and know how to formulate the question is kind of like the biggest part of it, and it can be the hardest one as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
I can completely relate to that. And now that we've talked about like the quantitative data a lot, we would like to know, because it's always super interesting to ask, if you being in the analyst team, if you receive qualitative feedback reports from player facing teams in the company to complement your quantitative data. If this happens, how does it work?
So again, it really depends on the type of company and the type of game you are working for at the moment. And if it's a new game, you don't really have any player feedback coming in. But for big companies, big games where you need a community manager handling the requests of different players, then they do, kind of provide us these player sentiment for the game, for a particular feature as well, and they give us, PowerPoint reports. Okay, what's happening in the community right now? What are they feeling? What are they saying? So these reports do come in, but in terms of numbers, I wouldn't say that they are the quantity of these values can be determined uh, from the reports that is provided from the player facing teams.
And
But in my opinion, this yeah,
no,
go ahead,
sorry,
Natalie.
continue.
Yeah, so I was saying that for me, qualitative and quantitative data always goes hand in hand. Like if we have to understand where there's a drop off of players, that will only happen if there's a certain quantity of players actually did that. So to identify a point at the drop off point, the quantity has to be quite huge compared to the other drop off points.
Definitely. And I know that you mentioned, you just talked about it a bit now, but can you tell us a bit about how do you intertwine player insights, qualitative and quantitative data? Maybe you have an example that you had a question of like the what happened, but then you had the what in terms of the data, but then you didn't have the why. How do you intertwine these types of data points?
So, like I mentioned, like they do go hand in hand, and there was a time we tried to do player surveys. After certain number of matches that a player plays, we try to do player surveys and try to find answers like why, what did you didn't like, what did you liked about the game, and so on. So in terms of this, they are able to tell us the right answers sometimes, but the quantity of players actually answering those surveys is so low, and also the sample size may not be the right sample because very few people actually try to answer these surveys, and only those players answer these surveys who are really engaged into the game, and you never know what the non-engaged players are actually want to say. So in those terms it becomes hard, but in terms of from a numbers perspective that we look at whatever we can get from the player data, they always go hand in hand.
This has been some amazing insights, so thank you for that. And for the last question, I know it can be super hard, but we would love to know if there would be a dream insight you could get from your players, what would it be?
I guess I've already talked about it, and that's what makes a player leave the game in the FTOE. So this is like one of the hardest questions a lot of games face. Even games who are in their live operations phase, and they see that okay, the D1 retention is dropping off. So why is it dropping off? So that question is the hardest. And like I said, identifying the trigger points, you can still do that. You can identify the trigger points at what point the players are dropping off. But what led them there is something that it's very hard from the data because you don't have any other data for these players except for, okay, they dropped at this point and they played the previous 4-5 steps. So yeah, that's the my biggest dream inside if I ever can get that.
Definitely. And that's an awesome way to end the podcast. So, Ayush, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to participate in today's podcast. It was super interesting to learn about your role as an analyst team lead and how player feedback influences your position.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie.
And that's it for today. Let's Talk Customer Feedback is a podcast made for player insights professionals, player feedback enthusiasts, gaming industry experts, and anything in between. The podcast is created by Afogata, the AI-driven player feedback analytics platform that cuts through the noise and brings you the player insights that move the needle. In each episode, we have a special guest from the industry, including Afogata's own customers that share their knowledge on what player feedback and the voice of the customer means for them and the companies they work at. Follow Let's Talk Customer Feedback on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you'd like to know more about Afogata and what it does, go to afogata.com and get more info on our social media, searching for Afogata on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. See you next time. Don't keep your players waiting.